The ceasefire, as it stands, is fundamentally temporary and transactional rather than, let's say, strategic or durable. And it was reached not because the core issues were resolved, they absolutely weren't. Strategically, the conflict is still very much alive. The most likely trajectory is not an immediate collapse into full-scale war again, but rather a managed instability, where we will see a cycle of limited escalation, deterrence, signaling, periodic violations, skirmishes and exchanges of fire here and there. They're looking forward towards the reality of establishing a broader international Islamic diplomatic front that includes the Gulf, led by Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Indonesia. That would make a very strong political deterrence for the Gulf that can prevent such conflicts from happening again. Saudi Arabia wants a clear victory, a very clear victory that it created the Palestinian independent state. It will recognize Israel only if that goal is met.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Abdullah O Hayek again. You may recall him from our previous conversations on the Middle East. For those of you who have subscribed recently, Abdullah is an independent Middle East analyst and consultant based in Washington, D.C. And today we will be discussing the latest developments about the Iran war. Abdullah, thank you again for speaking to Fair Observer and welcome.
Thank you, Rohan. I'm very happy to be here again, and I sincerely look forward to our conversation.
Right. I'm going to hit you with the million-dollar question. Do you think the ceasefire will hold, or do you think Israel and the United States will resume strikes on Iran? Basically, what I want to know is, are they using these 2 weeks as a way to increase their buildup and strike again?
I think that is the million-dollar question, and from what we've seen so far, it seems that the ceasefire, as it stands, is fundamentally temporary and transactional rather than, let's say, strategic or durable. And it was reached not because the core issues were resolved, they absolutely weren't, but because, let's say, all the parties reached a point of operational pause. There was military exhaustion, there was economic disruption globally, diplomatic pressure from the region and Europe and the whole world converged at the same time. There are many different factors playing into that. Now, the reality is that the underlying drivers of the conflict remain fully intact. Iran still has a nuclear program. The nuclear trajectory is still in progress. Israel's determination to dismantle Iran's regional network of proxies is still in motion, and it still hasn't been achieved. And of course, the U.S. insistence on coercive leverage through the sanctions and economic pressure and maximum pressure campaign and now a maritime blockade all seem to be in motion as well. Now, what we're seeing on the ground also reinforces this fragility. Now, despite the ceasefire announced on April 8th, the U.S. has expanded its naval blockade of Iran, effectively sealing off its maritime trade. Now, the maritime blockade entails that the U.S. will not allow any Iranian ships to leave or enter Iranian ports unless with U.S. permission. It's a blockade in its essence. And at the same time, Iran is continuing to use these asymmetric tools, especially like the naval mines, like we described in our first appearance, you and I, in the Strait of Hormuz, to maintain leverage. And also at the same time, Israel has continued severe military operations in Lebanon. And that signals that it does not want the broader conflict resolved diplomatically. It wants to achieve its objective militarily. And it is, doing so ever since the war started in the Middle East with the whole crisis in October 7, 2023. So, in essence, the ceasefire is holding. but in a narrow and a technical sense. But strategically, the conflict is still very much alive. The most likely trajectory is not an immediate collapse into full-scale war again, but rather a managed instability, where we will see a cycle of limited escalation, deterrence, signaling, periodic violations, skirmishes and exchanges of fire here and there. But in that sense, a resumption of strikes like what we've seen from February 28th till April 8th is also still highly likely. It's what is the uncertainty is just the timing and the trigger and what issue will initiate the resumption of hostilities.
Right, Abdullah, I'll get to the bit about Lebanon later. For now, let's continue to hammer out what's happened in these 41 days of fighting. You've had Israel and the United States use air power to drastic effect, at least tactically, because they've succeeded in taking out all the senior leadership in Iran. They've hit missile and drone factories. They've hit ammunition depots. They've even hit, of course, civilian areas where they've carpet bombed schools, universities, hospitals, bridges. All of these are violations of the Geneva Convention. So what we're seeing is kind of desperation. But on the other hand, you've seen Iran's response. They've also taken things to the next level compared to the fighting in 2025 when it was a 12-day skirmish. This time, Iran has hit desalination plants. They've taken out oil refining facilities. They've even hit AI data centers of American companies in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia. Iran has also gone out guns blazing. Who do you think has come out on top? Do you think Israel and the US have been able to achieve their goals in 41 days of fighting? Or do you think Iran has been the one successful, where the IRGC, the Islamic Republic Guard Corps, is still standing strong? They've not collapsed.
I think that the outcome of these 41 days of fighting, it reflects a classic asymmetry between battlefield success and strategic positioning. Now, on the military level, conventionally, the United States and Israel clearly achieved tactical gains. They degraded Iranian military assets. That includes 90% of their ballistic missile production, their drone production factories. 90% of the Iranian Navy is gone. 70% of the Iranian Air Force is gone. There's also targeted leadership on behest of the Israelis, where they've taken out the supreme leader. They've taken out military leaders, political leaders, IRGC leaders at a very, very wide level. And both of them have demonstrated overwhelming superiority in every sense of the military level. However, it's important to recognize that wars of this kind, they're not decided purely by battlefield metrics. They're decided by whether political objectives and agendas are achieved. Now, that's the issue with this whole war. The United States, in particular, entered this war with no clearly stated objective. When the September 11th, 2001 attacks happened in New York and the Pentagon, the US invaded Afghanistan with the sole reason to go after the Al-Qaeda members who planned the attack and to go after the Taliban who was harboring those Al-Qaeda members. Obviously, clearly stated objective. Invasion of Iraq, 2003. They entered Iraq because they believed at the beginning that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and was going to use it to target American interests. And then there was a connection that they, even though both of them were a lie, they tried to connect Saddam Hussein with Osama bin Laden. Obviously an objective. But in this war, the US hasn't stated an objective. There is no clear end state. There was no schedule, there was no agenda, there was no goal that they wanted to reach. The Israelis, on the other hand, had an objective, and that was just regime change, that they wanted the regime in its entirety to collapse. Obviously, neither achieved their objective. And that brings us to another point where Iran, despite suffering a lot of damage, it has achieved something critical. It endured. It survived. It is now a country that is battle hardened. It is, fortified. Let's say its rhetoric that it has to continue resisting the great Satan and the little Satan to its people is, more maximized, because their narrative to their people now is that we're targeted, we're at the behest, at the crosshairs of these two powers, and we're fighting and we're winning, because for them survival is a victory. But more importantly, for Iran, it successfully shifted the conflict not from conventional military engagement or asymmetrical military engagement. It shifted the conflict into a new domain, into an economic and geopolitical domain. And that brings us to the Strait of Hormuz. Again, we've discussed this in our first interview. Roughly 20% of global energy flows goes through the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran shut it almost entirely. Now, that disruption alone impacts global costs. It raised oil prices, gas prices. It forced the US and its allies into a reactive posture, let's say. And it's very, you can strongly argue that one of the most devastating, significant consequences of this whole war has been the disruption of international trade and energy markets, rather than the decisive military defeat of Iran. That is the clear end game of this war. And there was also, another factor that could have played into this disruption of energy and trade markets, is that we forgot that it might have been worse if the Houthis in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait were entering the conflict and went ahead and did the same in the Red Sea. That would have been doubling down on this crisis. So if we break it down, in conclusion to this question, Israel and the US achieved tactical dominance. But have they shook the regime? Have they managed to, bring it closer to collapse? No. Iran, on the other hand, it achieved strategic disruption. And it managed, to show the world that, it can still fight on with its unconventional methods, not just its asymmetrical methods, its unconventional methods, economic disruption, trade disruption, civilian infrastructure targeted. And to argue, the real loser in this whole war is actually the regional system itself. There is no indication that says that the Middle East is now closer to being safe, to being more prosperous, to being more, stabilized. The regional system itself is losing. It's losing hard. So the bottom line is that there is no clear victor. It's only a reshaped battlefield where increased instability has become the new equilibrium.
Right. Actually, can you tell us more about the region? Because it's fascinating. The Arab countries, the Arab states in the Middle East, they didn't start this war, but they had to face the collateral damage. They had to face incoming Iranian ballistic missiles, Iranian drones. Their exports are stuck because the Strait of Hormuz is blocked. Countries like the UAE, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, all of them were hit. And in fact, there were massive protests in Bahrain because you've got a massive Shia community that is being governed by Sunni leadership. In fact, there were reports and there were rumors, in fact, that the US wanted a regime change in Iran. It might get one in Bahrain. But can you tell us what the Arab states must be feeling? Do you think they will still be open to normalizing ties with Israel after this? Also, do you think they will rely on the US after this for their security?
Well, the war obviously included the Arabs in a very strong manner. If we were to calculate the number of launches, whether they were drones, cruise missiles, or ballistic missiles, that Iran fired in the entirety of the war from February 28th to April 8th, 85% of them were targeted at the Gulf. 15% were targeted at Israel only. And that's thousands of drones and thousands of missiles. And these weren't just targeted at US military bases in those regions, they were targeted at civilian infrastructure primarily. Now, if we were to look at this war from the eyes of the monarchies of the Arabian Gulf, they navigated this war with a highly calibrated strategy that's essentially rooted in survival, economic stability, and strategic autonomy. For these countries, their military history is very brief, and you can only look at it from two lenses. The first lens is the Gulf War of 1990 to 1991. That was a success story for them. They entered the war because a fellow GCC country, Kuwait, was invaded by their neighbor Iraq, Saddam Hussein. They entered the war, they went ahead, they contributed ground troops, air assets, economic aid, they financed the war. And obviously the result was achieved by ousting Saddam from Kuwait. But then they have another story that is more or less rooted in failure, which is Yemen. From 2015 up until 2022, there was a Saudi-led intervention in the Yemeni civil war that was aimed at defeating the Houthis. And the Gulf and the broader Arab world entered the conflict with primarily air assets, but the Saudis and the Emiratis had ground troops there as well. But it ended in failure. And then rather than weakening the Houthis, they rather became more strengthened. So that's the two-sided memory mechanism that the Gulf have to going ahead and engaging in war. They could win, but they could also lose. One might not look like the other. So for them, the war with Iran presented many challenges. It presented many risks. And they looked at it primarily through three lenses: politically, militarily, and economically. Militarily, they're seeing that the two most powerful air forces in the world, most capable air forces in the world, the United States and Israel, are going ahead and striking Iranian targets left, right, and center, and they're not really causing any damage. So from their sense, they cause damage, but they're not really advancing the regime change collapse ideology, let's say. The Gulf saw that they're going in. What can we contribute? We certainly have advanced aircraft. We certainly have advanced air forces. But what are we going to contribute? We're not going to go ahead and do anything. And what's even worse is that even when we're not engaged in the conflict, we're still getting hit. So what happens if we actually get in the conflict? It's going to be worse. And especially that the cost ratio for intercepting these drones and missiles is very high. The drones, which were the primary weapon used to target the Gulf, they cost between $20,000 to $35,000, and the interceptors that the Gulf have cost between $1 million and $3 million each. So if they're going to go ahead and accelerate the interception rates, they're going to be drained financially. So that was the first factor disencouraging the Gulf from entering, which is the military. The political element, which, to be fair, had a motivation for the Gulf and had also a discouragement for the Gulf. The motivation was that if the Gulf entered the war right now on the side of the Americans and the Israelis, and the war ended in a victory, the Gulf can use that as a political victory to their peoples by saying, oh, we entered the war, we achieved victory against Iran, and it only happened after we entered. So that can be a political victory for the Gulf leaders. But the disencouragement was weighing much more on the scale than the motivation for the Gulf, because for the Gulf, they don't see a political victory regionally. The Gulf have always looked at their foreign policy and domestic policy almost intertwined, and their primary, issues politically have always been the Palestinian issue and the issue of the internal interventions in the affairs of their fellow Arab states beyond the Gulf. So for them, they look at the Gulf War. Okay, the Gulf War was achieved, but after the Gulf War, we had the 1991 Madrid Conference, where the Soviet Union and the US sponsored a Palestinian peace process. And then they had Oslo in 1993, which resulted in the first recognition of the Palestinian Authority. Right now, they're not seeing anything that the US or Israel can give them politically on that front. So that was more of a discouragement. There's no political victory. Economically, which is the far more greater discouragement for the Gulf states, is that even though they're not in the war and they're still getting hit much more than Israel, if they and the Strait of Hormuz is already closed, and the Gulf knows that the whole purpose of closing the Strait of Hormuz is not to really initiate global economic crisis, but rather to inflict economic warfare on themselves. And it really gave the Gulf immediate and severe economic implications, the Strait, because their economies are based on oil and gas, and the primary method of transportation lies through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Saudis have an east to west pipeline that they can go ahead and manage to do that, but the broader Gulf don't have an outlet on the Red Sea. But other than that, there was more economic disruption. For Dubai, example, throughout the entirety of the war, Dubai itself had an initial cost of $1 billion a day, with flight cancellations, with hotel cancellations, with expats leaving, with labor leaving. The economic toll was tremendous for the Gulf. So, with all that being said, at the same time, these states are not blindly aligning with either Washington or Israel. They're hedging. They're really hedging, and they still continue to rely on US economic guarantees. They still do. But, this war has exposed the limits of those guarantees, particularly the inability to prevent the spillover to their countries, or to protect their own economic lifelines, or to prevent them from being targeted with drones and missiles. And instead, as a result of all of this, the Arabian Gulf states are now increasingly investing in diplomacy, investing in political mediation. They're supporting mediation efforts such as those led by Pakistan, for example. The recent engagement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan in particular is tremendous, in my opinion. And we've seen participation on other regional powers, such as the Turks and the Egyptians and the Indonesians. They're looking forward towards the reality of establishing a broader international Islamic diplomatic front that includes the Gulf, led by Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Indonesia. That would make a very strong political deterrence for the Gulf that can prevent such conflicts from happening again. But also at the same time, they want to maintain open channels with Iran. We've seen, despite Saudi Arabia and the UAE being targeted, we've seen phone calls between the foreign ministers of the Gulf and Iran. And they would actually describe the foreign minister of Iran as brotherly, or His Excellency. And they're still being hit by it, which is a bit hypocritical, but nonetheless, they still want to maintain open channels with Iran. So in essence, the Gulf pursued a multi-layered approach, which essentially was de-escalate immediately, hedge strategically, and diversify long-term security partnerships. They're not participants in the war. They were trying to contain it, but they failed in doing so. But nonetheless, they insulated themselves from some consequences that could have been far more devastating and far more costly.
Right, Abdullah. The one thing I want to now shift the focus to is, of course, Israel and the United States, because as we're speaking on the 16th of April, yes, there is a short ceasefire. Yes, Pakistan is mediating the talks. In fact, today, Pakistan's Field Marshal Asim Munir is in Iran. He is in Tehran. He is meeting the Iranian leadership. He is spearheading the mediation. But on the other hand, you've got Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, and Donald Trump, the president of the United States. Now, they are looking at this totally differently because the goal that they went into with when it came to hitting Iran was regime change, which has not happened, the collapse of the IRGC, which has not happened, hitting and taking out enriched uranium from Iran, which has also not happened. So it looks like Israel and the United States have not achieved a single political objective except for removing some of the senior leadership who've now been replaced with younger men. White beards have been replaced by black beards. So it looks like there's a lot of domestic pressure now piling up on Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. In fact, the United States you're in the United States, you're in DC. There's going to be midterm elections in November, and almost every political analyst is saying that Trump is going to get humiliated because of the war in Iran. At the same time, you've got Israel, where Netanyahu is facing severe charges of corruption against him. It looks like it could be the end of the political careers of both Trump and Netanyahu if the ceasefire holds as it is now and they do not get what they wanted in Iran. How are you reading this?
I believe that all what you just described and mentioned is ultimately a question of time horizons versus political pressures. For Iran, it operates on a long strategic timeline. Its doctrine is built around endurance, attrition, asymmetric leverage, and survival. It does not need decisive victory. It just simply needs to avoid collapse and continue collecting costs. And a great example of that was the Strait of Hormuz. They mined the waterway, they disrupted shipping. Iran created a global pressure point that works in its favor over time. On the contrary, the United States and Israel, they operate under much shorter political timelines. Now, President Trump, he faces domestic economic pressure from rising energy prices, political scrutiny over the war's objectives, political opposition not just from the Democratic Party, but from allies within his own Republican Party. The war obviously lost Trump the Congress in the midterm elections. I am in strong favor of that. But he still has time to fix it. He still has time to reverse the negative effects that it might have on his party in the upcoming elections. It definitely has. Now, for Netanyahu, on the other hand, he faces his own internal pressures that are far greater. And that includes public dissatisfaction and the need to demonstrate tangible gains. Now, why is Netanyahu's case greater than that of Trump's? Because Israel had civilian casualties. Israel had civilian infrastructure targeted. Israel had towers and buildings that were struck and destroyed. Israel had almost 20 civilian casualties, which is a very big number for Israel. Israel has been in this constant state of war since October 7th, 2023, and according to the self-proclaimed Netanyahu doctrine, it has not achieved defeat to its enemies. It has not achieved a victory for Israel over its enemies compared to the traditional Israeli victories of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which were swift and decisive. This is the first time that Israel engages in a war that's longer than a few months. The Israeli public sees that, and they see that Netanyahu, being the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, and already under corruption charges, and his inability to go ahead and defeat the enemy, they see this all as more than enough of a reason that he needs to go. And it's getting clearer day by day. It's very obvious. So, in my opinion, I believe that Israel right now has to really clearly state an objective, because traditionally Israel has preferred to engage in war, but also it has preferred to engage in diplomacy. A great example of that was Egypt. You know, the 48 war, the 56 Suez crisis, the 6-Day War of 67, the October War 73, but then it had the Camp David Accords, it had the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, and it lasts to this day. Now, it's definitely not going to happen in the Iranian case. We're definitely not going to see Mujtaba Khamenei or Ibrahim Raisi visiting Jerusalem, or the other way around. But it can still reach its objective politically. But I think that timeline has escaped Israel. Iran right now is much more hardened. It's much more radical. It's much more determined that it can survive despite superior military conventional capabilities of its adversaries. And as I mentioned earlier, it can afford to wait longer. It can wait and endure blockades. It can wait and endure being struck by superior military aircraft. But again, it's also affecting Iran, because Iran is under immense economic strain due to the upcoming blockade that the US is about to impose on its ports, which will also severely impact its trade and its oil and gas exports, by the way, which is going to affect Iran very, very much so. So it's all, I think this is all a quagmire. The political victories, they're achieved by victories that are involving money and involving military. The US didn't achieve either. Israel didn't achieve either. Iran really didn't achieve either, if you really think about it. Everyone's a loser in this. The question is about who's going to lose his political career the quickest. Trump doesn't go ahead and guarantee the win of the Republican Party in a majority in Congress, and there's a Democratic majority, then he is definitely going to face impeachment proceedings. Whether they'll succeed or not, that's a question. Netanyahu, his political bloc is going to face massive opposition in the Knesset. It's going to affect his political career and possibly his freedom. He might end up in jail. Iran, it doesn't really matter because they don't work democratically.
Right. Okay. So one of the interesting things that was happening was when Pakistan was conducting these ceasefire talks in Islamabad, they actually called it the Islamabad talks. Of course, there was representation from the United States, led by Vice President J.D. Vance. There was also representation from Iran, led by their Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Interestingly, Israel was not allowed. They were not permitted to attend these talks because Pakistan says that they don't recognize Israel as a nation, as a country. And it was during these talks when Israel really ramped up its attacks in Lebanon, striking what they're saying is Hezbollah. But there is enough evidence that Israel has also struck civilian and residential buildings in southern Lebanon, even in Beirut. So why do you think Israel was, when they didn't have to, when they were not going after Iran, suddenly they just shifted targets and they started bombing Lebanon? Why do you think Israel is doing that?
Lebanon has always been the metric that Israel puts on its adversaries during mediations. Now, it might not participate in those mediations, but Lebanon is always the metric to impose pressure. When the Camp David talks between Anwar al-Sadat and Menachem Begin, sponsored by Jimmy Carter, were happening, when the talks were beginning to not result in a political positive outcome, Begin went ahead and invaded Lebanon. And that moved the ball rolling more into, let's get this done with, and maybe that will end the war in Lebanon. Israel's using the same thing right now. But that's only for a political purpose. If we were to look at Israel's operations in Lebanon now, they reflect a fundamental strategic calculation, and that is that Hezbollah is not just a secondary, unimportant front. It is a central, unresolved threat. This is not Israel's first rodeo with Hezbollah. From Israel's perspective, any ceasefire in Lebanon that excludes Hezbollah and its disarmament or its defeat is not just incomplete, it's dangerous, because they're seeing the trajectory with Iran right now. After continued strikes are going to become more determined and more radical. They're going to see that same formula extend to Hezbollah. So from the Israeli perspective, Hezbollah remains the most immediate, most capable military actor aligned with Iran. And what's worse is that it's right above Israel's border. And this creates a divergence. It creates a divergence between diplomatic frameworks and military realities. The United States was very clear when it announced the ceasefire on April 8th that Lebanon is not included in the ceasefire. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said that very clearly. And that was something that Trump had to concede to Netanyahu, because Netanyahu saw that there was no clearly defeat of Iran, and he wanted, to deliver a victory for his own political purposes, and he had to do that in Lebanon. And while Pakistan and other mediators have attempted to broaden the ceasefire to include Lebanon, Israel is explicitly rejecting that linkage continuously, and it doesn't want to do that. It wants to defeat Hezbollah once and for all. And we're seeing the remarks go ahead, not just from members of the Israeli Knesset, but from members of the Israeli parliament, of the Israeli cabinet, sorry. And both, there's two types of statements, and they're both equally worse than the other. We're seeing statements from Bezalel Smotrich, who's the Minister of Finance in the Israeli cabinet, who's saying we have to annex southern Lebanon from the Litani River down to the Israeli border. That has to become part of Israel proper. And then we have the Israeli Foreign Minister, Israel Katz, saying that we're going to remain in the area between the Litani River and the Israeli border permanently. No annexation mentioned, nothing particularly specific mentioned, but we're going to stay there permanently. So they have a radical annexation narrative, and you have a attempted diplomatic balancing narrative. So in essence, it's using its continued military pressure in Lebanon, Israel, as both a bargaining tool and a means of shaping a post-war environment that would obviously deliver a political victory for Netanyahu and his coalition in the Knesset. But there's also, an additional domestic political pressure element, is that Netanyahu himself, he can't afford to appear restrained while Hezbollah remains operational. A lot of, I don't know the number in particular, but it's a very big number. A lot of Israelis have abandoned their homes in northern Israel ever since October 7th happened, and they have still not returned. That is a very strong motivation for Netanyahu to go after Hezbollah, because that will affect his votes. That will affect his candidates who want to join his coalition from the seats that voters in the north vote in. It's all political. It's all about votes. So for him, the continued strikes, they signal resolve. They maintain deterrence. They strengthen Israel's negotiating position. Now, they might not defeat Hezbollah. Hezbollah might remain. But the fact that he still is striking them is going to deliver that message that we're not thinking of leaving Hezbollah behind. We're going after it. We're going to defeat it. So, it's a dual track approach for Israel right now. It's engaging diplomatically, but simultaneously it's reshaping the battlefield in an attempt to make its image better in front of its own people.
Right. So do you think Israel doesn't want the war to stop? Do you think they want to keep going and going, at least till Netanyahu is the prime minister?
Well, I don't think any country really wants the war to stop. I'm sure Israel wants the war to stop, but it seems to be enjoying it. I don't know. It seems someone who's been in a constant state of war for the past almost 2.5 years, and you're still going at it without some clearly set objective, it kind of seems that you want the war to go ahead. But let's say, according to them as attempted peacemakers, they do want the war to stop. They want it to stop under conditions that fundamentally alter the strategic regional landscape in their favor. That includes that a simple ceasefire that restores the regional pre-war status is not really acceptable from Israel's perspective. It needs to have the regional status in its favor. It has to have its adversaries weakened, the possibility of diplomatic channels and normalization increased in its favor, and it wants to see some sort of new alternative, a new dimension that includes economic positive outcomes for Israel. And we're seeing that in its favor with the Strait of Hormuz being shut down. Everyone is exploring new logistics routes, new transportation routes. That might include the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which really works in favor of Israel. We're seeing, the Red Sea becoming a new hub for logistics and transportation, and Israel has an outlet on the Red Sea. So that could be a very strong economic motivation for them. So at this stage right now, back to your question of whether Israel wants to stop the war, it does not believe that either of these objectives have been fully achieved. The Iranian capabilities have been degraded, but they haven't been eliminated. Hezbollah is still active. The Lebanese armed forces are not willing to go ahead and disarm Hezbollah for a toothpick. As a result, for all of this, Israel sees continued military pressure not only necessary but vital in order for them to secure a more favorable outcome in front of their own people. So this creates a conditional approach to peace. Israel's open to ending the war, but only if it results in lasting strategic gains. And Lebanon is obviously the greatest example of that, because historically, Israel dealt with its Arab neighbors in a land for peace deal, where Israel would return occupied territories in return for a peace treaty. Right now, it's doing the opposite. It's telling the Lebanese government that if you want your land back, I need peace first, which is quite unusual, but they're willing to explore that option first. So until whatever threshold Israel wants is met, it's likely to continue limited operations, even within the framework of negotiations or a current ceasefire.
Okay, staying with Israel, how do you think public perception in the Gulf states and the United States has changed about Israel? Because we're slowly seeing that Iran has beautifully built their narrative on social media. In fact, if you go on X, Iran has been instrumental in displaying their narrative. They've used amazing animation, they've used Lego cartoons, they've used Tom and Jerry, all of it to kind of depict that it was the United States and Israel, of course, as they like to say, the little Satan and the great Satan, striking Iran. But at least on social media, there's this feeling that a lot of the people in Arab states are unhappy with Israel. They think that being on sides with Israel will ultimately lead to never-ending wars. And that narrative is slowly picking up in the United States as well. MAGA is divided over support to Israel. So how are you seeing this? Can you tell us more about this public perception about Israel now?
Public sentiment towards Israel has shifted tremendously and very noticeably, but in different ways across different regions. And in the US, the shift has been characterized more by war fatigue and skepticism rather than outright opposition to Israel. They don't hate Israel for being Israel. They hate Israel for dragging America into Israel's wars and Israel being a recipient of American foreign and military aid, but no clear benefit to the US. There is a growing concern about the cost of the conflict, the lack of a clear objective of an end game, of the broader implications this has on US involvement in also another war in the Middle East. The political divisions are deepening. We're seeing, members who have traditionally been pro-Israel, like Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, if we were to look through his footage 2 decades ago, you can almost say he was an Israeli. Right now, he is an outright oppositionist and very opposed to Israel. So this creates debates. This creates controversial engagements about executive authority, war powers, becoming independent, becoming more prominent. Which way? This all has the Israel factor in mind. In the Gulf, the shift is more pronounced, more negative. During the last days of the Biden administration, from the onset of October 7th till his last days, let's be specific, we had this track that there was about to be new normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But obviously that didn't happen because Saudi Arabia cannot afford to lose its status as the leader of the Arab and Islamic worlds with recognizing Israel without a clear objective on the Palestinian front. It saw that formula happen when the UAE joined the Abraham Accords with Israel in 2020. Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the UAE, is unfortunately described right now as the devil of the Arabs because he essentially forsake the Palestinian factor in his normalization with Israel. Saudi Arabia doesn't want that. Saudi Arabia wants a clear victory, a very clear victory that it created the Palestinian independent state. It will recognize Israel only if that goal is met. And it will not forsake that, and it has done so repeatedly over the decades, not just in recent years. So, that in mind, we're forgetting other factors. Before the war in Iran right now, and after the June war of last year, in September, Israel went ahead and launched airstrikes in a fellow GCC country, Qatar. That's something that the Gulf, its entirety, not just Qatar, will never forget. That Israeli jets flew over Gulf airspace, launched missiles in Gulf airspace, and targeted Gulf territory. That raises a very major question, is that how can we guarantee Israel's aggression wouldn't expand to us? Qatar is a major non-NATO ally of the US. Qatar has Al Udeid Air Base, which hosts almost 11,000 US troops, and still it got struck. So that raises a question about the guarantees that Israel can provide to the Gulf about their sovereignty, about their security, about their safety as a whole. So, with all of that said, public opinion in the Arabian Gulf has been shaped by the perception that Israeli actions are contributing to regional instability, to continued war, to directly contributing to economic disruption of Gulf economies, particularly through disruptions in energy markets, in the oil market, in the shipping routes, in the Strait of Hormuz. The Gulf sees that this is all happening because Israel decided to go after Iran. Whereas if Israel hadn't gone after Iran, that wouldn't have happened. So they're seeing Israel as a disruptor, if not at the same level of Iran, maybe a bit less, that it's a regional disruptor as well. So they remain skeptical about this. And I think that the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz has amplified these concerns. It has really put it at the front stage of all of this. And it makes the costs of both escalation with Iran and potential normalization with Israel more controversial for the Gulf populations as a whole. Now, true, they don't have the Palestinian factor in their minds the same way countries like Egypt or Jordan or Syria do, due to they're more directly involved nature in the conflict. But still, Israel remains a very important factor in the Gulf political perception, let's say. But at the leadership level, cooperation with Israel remains pragmatic. It remains interest-based, let's say. It really revolves around what objectives can be met, and if they can be met, okay. If not, okay. That's how it works. So this divergence between elite strategy and public sentiment is really becoming one of the defining features of the post-war regional landscape in the Middle East that concerns Israel, Iran, and the Arabian Gulf states.
Abdullah, as always, it was a pleasure having you, and thank you very much for speaking to Fair Observer.
Of course, thank you very much for having me, Rohan. I really had a great time having this, and I hope next time our conversation will be about a more stabilized region.
Absolutely.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.